Provision and use of work equipment regulations, Puwer. Platform lifts, passenger lifts, service lifts, goods lifts, home lifts, stair lifts, scissor lift, person and goods. Note, should you wish to avoid reading the informative content below, if a LOLA inspection is performed by Base Lift Services on your lifting equipment and it is compliance with LOLA, you are covered for your Puwer requirements also on this equipment. As well as offering LOLA on the main passenger lift brands, our technicians have the specialist knowledge to perform LOLA on Aritco, Sibes, Dalby, Gartec, Kalia, Motola, Nomi, and TD, Phoenix, Pollock, Stana and Vimac. Click here to jump to the Base Lift Services LOLA information page. The below information helps explain a lift owner's obligations under Puwer. The differences between LOLA and Puwer. LOLA and Puwer are two sets of health and safety regulations. The lifting operations and lifting equipment regulations, LOLA. And the provision and use of work equipment regulations, Puwer. When does LOLA apply? When does Puwer? And when do both? What are the similarities and differences? LOLA and Puwer are two sets of health and safety regulations. The lifting operations and lifting equipment regulations, LOLA. And the provision and use of work equipment regulations, Puwer. Both sets of regulations apply to equipment and have some overlap in the way they apply. For some equipment and activities, you might need to comply with one regulation. For others, you might need to comply with both. So when does LOLA apply? When does Puwer? And when do both? What are the similarities and differences between these health and safety regulations? Puwer. The provision and use of work equipment regulations, Puwer, apply to work equipment. That's all types and any equipment used at work. If you own, operate, use or have control over work equipment, Puwer applies. Puwer requires all equipment used at work to be suitable and safe for use, correctly installed, maintained and used. It should have suitable health and safety controls and markings. LOLA. The lifting operations and lifting equipment regulations, LOLA, apply to, you guessed it, lifting equipment and operations. If you own, operate or control lifting equipment, these regulations apply. A lifting operation could be the lifting or lowering of any load, including materials, people, or other equipment. Lifting equipment must be fit for purpose, suitable for the task, marked and subject to periodic inspections. LOLA and Puwer. LOLA and Puwer are often referred to together because they do have some overlap. Both sets of regulations apply to equipment. Both sets of regulations place duties and requirements on the inspection and installation of equipment. LOLA only applies to lifting equipment. Puwer applies to all equipment. The names of the regulations kind of give this difference away. But it's important to remember that lifting equipment is still equipment, so both LOLA and Puwer apply here. But if we already have Puwer, and that covers inspection, installation, maintenance and suitability of work equipment, why do we need LOLA? The best way to think of it is that LOLA includes some extra requirements for lifting equipment. So lifting equipment must comply with all the requirements of Puwer, which we cover in more depth in what Puwer stands for. But it must also comply with the additional requirements of LOLA, which we also cover in more detail in what LOLA stands for. Here are some of the main differences to be aware of. Markings. Both sets of regulations require markings. But because Puwer covers a variety of equipment, it's not specific in what markings you need. Every employer shall ensure that work equipment is marked in a clearly visible manner with any marking appropriate for reasons of health and safety. The provision and use of work equipment regulations 1998 markings. Now, it might be fairly obvious to think that, for lifting equipment, you need to know what weight the equipment can lift. It might seem appropriate for the weight the equipment can safely lift to be marked on it. So, if you were thinking this, you are one step ahead. LOLA, because it's specific to lifting equipment, does detail the markings required for safe working loads on equipment. The regulation goes on to require marking of lifting accessories and marking of the equipment to show if it is designed for the lifting of persons. Stability. Both sets of regulations require equipment to be stable. This makes sense because any equipment that's unstable could overturn or lose control and hurt someone. It's common sense that lifting equipment needs to be stable during any lifting operation. So it needs the strength and stability for the load it will be lifting. And yes, that is exactly what Lola adds to the requirements for lifting equipment. Inspections. Both sets of regulations require equipment to be inspected after installation and before being put into service for the first time, and after assembly at a new site or in a new location. Both sets of regulations also require equipment to be examined at suitable intervals to ensure any deterioration can be detected and remedied in good time. So these requirements are the same. The difference can be found in that while Puwer only goes as far as to say suitable intervals, Lola goes further. It gives a maximum time frame between thorough examinations. You have probably noticed that many of the differences between Lola and Puwer aren't really differences at all. Lola actually expands on the requirements under Puwer to make them more specific to lifting equipment. Thus, if your lifting equipment is issued a Lola certificate by Base Lift Service Limited,